The Ottoman Empire ran a tax system. Most empires do: grain taxes, land taxes, livestock taxes. The Ottomans collected all of those, but there was one levy that didn't appear in the same ledgers as wheat or silver. It had its own registers, its own officers, its own imperial decrees. And the commodity it tracked wasn't grain, it was boys. The system had a name. Devshirme in Turkish, it means to collect, not to steal, not to abduct. To collect. The way you collect a harvest. The way you collect a debt. Ottoman bureaucrats used that word deliberately, because bureaucracies are very good at making something monstrous sound like administration. The mechanics of it were precise. An imperial decree called a firm and authorized each collection. Officers were dispatched to the Christian provinces of the empire, primarily the Balkans. Their instructions specified a quota, roughly one boy per 40 households. An official secretary travelled with them to record everything. The system ran this way, roughly every 3 to 5 years, for nearly 300 years. If you've never heard of this, you're not alone. But some of those records survive today in the Ottoman archives in Istanbul. They describe in careful bureaucratic detail exactly how an empire collected children. If this is the kind of history that keeps you watching, subscribing takes 2 seconds. It helps more people find stories like this one. When the officers arrived in a village, their first stop wasn't the village square. It was the church. The local priest was required, by law, to produce the baptismal registers of every family in his parish, every boy's name, every boy's age, written down by the church itself, years before the officers ever arrived, in records kept to track Christian births. The empire took those records and used them to identify Christian children. The church's own documentation of its flock became a targeting list. Boys between roughly 8 and 18 were assembled for inspection. Officers examined them the way you'd expect livestock to be examined. Height, build, health, physical condition, what one source describes as an intelligent look. Only sons were exempt. Orphans were exempt. Married boys were exempt. Boys who were too tall or too short were rejected. The criteria were specific because this was a government program with specific outputs in mind. Each boy selected was then entered into a register called an Eshkal Defteri, a description ledger. His physical characteristics recorded in ink, hair colour, eye colour, build, any birthmarks or distinguishing features, his father's name, his village, his age. A complete physical profile of a child, written by the hand of the man taking him. Some of those registers survive. You can look at them. Pages and pages of entries. Each one a boy, reduced to a line item. Then the boys were separated from their families. Accounts describe mothers wailing, clinging to their sons as soldiers pulled them away. Fathers standing still, helpless. A Serbian soldier named Konstantin Mihailovic, who became a Janissary in the 15th century and later wrote his Memoirs of a Janissary, described the collectors taking children just as wolves take lambs from the flock. He knew. He'd been there. The boys were marched away in groups, sometimes roped together to prevent escape, toward regional collection points, then onward to the capital. The journey took weeks, sometimes months. What happened next is the part nobody expects. They weren't sent to barracks. They weren't handed a weapon. Most of these boys, after being taken from their families, recorded in a ledger, and marched hundreds of miles from home, were sent to live with Turkish farming families in Anatolia. For 7 to 8 years, the Ottomans called it Turkaverm, giving to the Turks. The boys worked the land. They learned Turkish. They were circumcised and formally converted to Islam. Their Christian birth names, the names their mothers gave them, were replaced with Muslim names, and over the course of those years, living in a different language, in a different religion, far from everything they'd known, those names their mothers gave them stopped feeling like theirs. This wasn't an accident. The empire understood something that's obvious in retrospect. A boy who still speaks his mother's language is a boy who might still feel loyalty to his mother's people. 7 years of immersion was long enough to make that loyalty functionally impossible. The system didn't just take children, it understood that taking them wasn't enough. The identity erasure was a designed phase, engineered, deliberate, and measured in years. After Anatolia, the surviving boys entered the Asemi-Olan, the novice corps for rigorous military training. The boys who arrived as farmhands left as soldiers. These were the Janissaries, the empire's elite infantry, and for centuries they were the most feared fighting force in the known world. Almost every one of them had begun as a Christian boy collected from a Balkan village. But the military pipeline was only one output of the system. The most exceptional boys, selected during sorting at the capital, were pulled aside entirely. They didn't go to Anatolia. They went to the Enderun, the palace school inside Topkapı Palace. The curriculum there would have surpassed most European universities of the era. Arabic, Persian, Turkish, arts, sciences, mathematics, statecraft, military strategy, poetry. These stolen boys received a world-class education, and the empire expected a return on it. The graduates of the Enderun became Grand Viziers, the second most powerful position in the empire. Provincial governors, Grand Admirals, the chief architect. For much of the Ottoman Empire's peak, the men actually running the state were boys who had been taken from Christian families in Serbia, Greece, Bulgaria, Bosnia, Albania. The empire built this deliberately. Boys with no family connections, no tribal loyalties, no inherited wealth. They couldn't build rival power bases. Their only loyalty was upward to the Sultan. The system produced a governing class that was, by design, completely dependent on the man at the top. In Ottoman political logic, being a kul, a slave of the Sultan, wasn't degradation. It was the closest position to absolute power that existed. The more completely you belonged to the Sultan, the more power the Sultan could extend to you. The system was monstrous, and by its own logic, it worked. Among all the boys the Devshirme consumed, one name contains the entire paradox of the system in a single life. His birth name was Pasha Sokollu. He was Serbian, Orthodox Christian, from a village near Visegrad in what's now Bosnia. He was taken through the Devshirme around 1516 at approximately 18 years old. Unusually late. Old enough to remember everything. There's a story, whether legend or fact, it's persisted, that as the column of boys was marched out of his village, his mother ran after them. Pasha reached into his belt and threw his knife back to her. It was the last object that passed between them. He rose. Through the Janissary ranks, through the palace system, all the way to Grand Vizier, the highest appointed office in the empire, he served 3 sultans over 14 consecutive years. One of the most powerful men in the world, in 1557, Sokollu Mehmed Pasha used that power to restore the Serbian Orthodox Patriarchate of Peć, which had been abolished. He installed his own relative, Makarija Sokollović, as patriarch. He quietly rebuilt something the empire had tried to destroy, using authority the empire itself had given him. He also commissioned a bridge. The Mehmed Pasha Sokollović Bridge in Visegrad, over the river near his childhood village. He commissioned it from another Devshirme boy, a man named Mimar Sinan, who'd been taken from a Christian family in Anatolia and had become the greatest architect the Ottoman Empire ever produced. A stolen Serbian child commissioning a stolen Anatolian child to build a bridge over the river of his own childhood. That bridge still stands. It's a UNESCO World Heritage Site. Not every family waited quietly for the officers to arrive. Fathers cut off their sons' fingers, deliberately, to disqualify them from the physical inspection. Communities organised mass early marriages of boys barely old enough to understand what marriage meant, because married boys were exempt. Families bribed collection officers to skip their sons or falsify records. When bribery failed, they hid their children in forests and mountain villages. And when all of that failed, some families made the most painful calculation available to them. They converted to Islam, because the Devshirme applied only to Christians. In Albania and Bosnia, mass conversion to Islam. Changes in faith that shaped those regions for centuries was driven in significant part by parents trying to keep their sons. There were also uprisings. In the Greek region of Epirus in 1565, communities attacked collection officers outright to protect their children. The most dramatic resistance came from a single man. George Kastriotti, an Albanian nobleman's son, taken through the Devshirme as a boy, converted, renamed Iskander, trained as an Ottoman military officer. In 1443, during the chaos of a military campaign, he defected, rode back to Albania, reconverted to Christianity, and then spent 25 years fighting the empire that had raised him, using every military tactic the Ottomans had taught him. The Albanians called him Skanderbeg. He became their national hero. The system's most spectacular failure, and the clearest proof that the identity erasure was never quite as total as the empire needed it to be. And across the Balkans, the grief was preserved in another way entirely. Folk songs. The Serbs called their laments tujbalis. The Greeks had songs about the paidomazoma, the child gathering, a recurring theme across these traditions. The mother who doesn't recognize her own son when he returns years later, wearing Ottoman uniform. These songs survived for centuries because the people who sang them needed somewhere to put what the official registers didn't record. The Devshirme didn't end because the empire recognized a moral failure. By the late 16th century, the Janissaries had become powerful enough to demand, and win, the right to marry and enroll their own sons in the corps. The Devshirme was no longer the only path in. Then something stranger happened. Muslim families began bribing officers to include their sons in the levy. The system that had been designed as an obligation imposed on Christian subjects had become so associated with power and prestige that Muslim families wanted access to it. The blood tax had become an aspiration. Corruption spread through the system. Officers took payments to skip boys or falsify eligibility. The precision machinery rusted. The last confirmed large-scale Devshirme collection was around 1637 to 1638. After 300 years, the collections simply stopped, not by decree, not by moral reckoning. The system became unworkable and was quietly abandoned. The Janissaries themselves lasted longer. By the 19th century, they'd become an entrenched political class, making and unmaking sultans, blocking every attempt at military modernization. In 1826, Sultan Mahmud II had enough. He surrounded their barracks with artillery and gave the order. The event is recorded in Ottoman history as the Vakai Hayrai, the auspicious incident. The weapons the machine had spent 3 centuries producing turned on the machine, and the machine's successor destroyed them all in a single day. There are pages in the Ottoman archives that list physical descriptions of boys: height, build, hair colour, birthmarks, father's name, village. There is no record of the mother's name. No record of what the house looked like the morning after the column marched out. The system documented the asset. It did not document the loss. The folk songs filled that gap. Generations of oral tradition across the Balkans preserved what the registers could not: the grief, the fear, the names the empire erased. Mimar Sinan, the boy who would become the greatest architect of his age, was taken from a Christian family near Kayseri in Anatolia around 1512. He designed over 300 structures: the Süleymaniye Mosque, the Selimi Mosque in Aden, which many architects consider his masterpiece. He lived to somewhere around 98 years old. His buildings are still standing. His Christian birth name is still debated by scholars. The system erased it so completely that we aren't certain what his mother called him. Somewhere in those Ottoman archives, there is an entry in a description register: a boy's height, his build. A note about his features, written in the hand of the man who took him. That boy would design buildings that have outlasted every empire, every war, every border drawn since. But in the register, he isn't an architect, he isn't a genius, he's a line item in a tax that was paid in children. The system wasn't defined by cruelty. Cruelty requires awareness. The Devshirme was defined by indifference. The particular indifference of a bureaucracy that has decided some things are simply resources to be collected. And machines do not record grief. If you want to see more history that the records almost forgot, subscribe. There's a lot more coming. Thank you for watching.